You're listening to Live from Lord North Street, a podcast from the Institute of Economic Affairs. The deadline for large companies to report their gender pay gap measurements has passed. We're now facing a huge influx of data, most of which fails to show a meaningful comparison between men and women in like-for-like roles. What is the right way to calculate a gender pay gap? The IEA's former head of tech and now policy analyst at the CATO Institute, Diego Zuluaga, joins us today to look at the case of the ride-sharing app Uber and what its data can teach us about pay gaps. Interviewed by the IEA's digital officer Madeline Grant, the pair discuss the wider implications of gender pay gaps. How do they originate? What do they mean for women? And has public policy throughout the world been effective in tackling the gap? If you like what you hear, subscribe to our iTunes channel, IEA Conversations.
A recent study on the ride-sharing app Uber by economists from the University of Chicago and Stanford revealed that male drivers are being paid on average 7% more than female users of the app. Diego, can you firstly give us a brief overview of the study itself and why these findings are being considered so significant?
Well, one of the wonderful things about Uber, not just from a passenger but from an economist perspective, is that it generates a tremendous amount of data. And through the use of an algorithm, it can control for a lot of factors which in economic life we wouldn't be able to control for. And so when it comes to trying and analyzing particular economic phenomena that we see, data from Uber is useful. So a few years ago, just to set the context, a few years ago, a study was conducted looking at the extent to which people benefited from a ride-sharing app. And the way they could do it was because they had data on how passengers would react to particular prices from Uber at every single price point. And so on the basis of how people decided whether or not to take a ride, you could get an idea of what economists call the demand curve for ride-sharing services. And on that basis, you could derive the consumer surplus that resulted from that. And the figures were staggering. The result was something like $6.8 billion were generated in consumer value on top of the service that they got for the price that they got, thanks to the emergence of an app of this nature, and that's just for the US alone on an annual basis. Now, similarly, this result, looking at the gender pay gap, is useful because the Uber app doesn't discriminate on the supply side between men and women. The way in which you are allocated a ride, you are offered a ride as a driver, has nothing to do with your gender. It's not a factor in the algorithm. Of course, that would be illegal. But also, on the demand side, if I, as a user, am requesting a ride, there is no way for me to discriminate between providers. So the usual concerns as to the extent of discrimination in certain sectors or particular areas of the economy is controlled for in the Uber app, because it is not transparent to the passenger. They just have to deal with whatever they're offered, and they only find out after the fact, right? So all of those things help us sift out some of the things that we would like to tease out from the data. That's why this study is particularly useful. And it was conducted by some economists from Uber, as you said, some economists from Stanford University. And what they find is that, as you say, male drivers earn 7% more than female drivers, but all of that gap is explained by factors that have nothing to do with gender, or that are third factors which are correlated differently with different genders.
Yeah, so all the normal things that advocates of people who want the government to fix the gender pay gap in some way would cite as reasons for those differentials are simply absent in this study. Another one, I think, which is quite important was the absence of bargaining with the Uber app, because the prices are all determined through the algorithm itself. So there's no opportunity for male drivers or female drivers to bargain for more money. So it really is, would you say it's a kind of almost like a one-of-a-kind study? Well,
that's actually a very important factor. So thank you for bringing it up, because, one of the things that emerges in more sophisticated discussions of the gender pay gap is that perhaps men are more aggressive than women in negotiating price or negotiating remuneration. This is something that came up in the conversation between Kathy Newman and Jordan Peterson on Channel 4 a few weeks ago.
So what you're saying is...
Exactly that. He specifically said that women tend to be more agreeable, and therefore that might be a factor in their not being able to secure as high a wage as they otherwise might. Now, of course, this is not a factor that is present with Uber, because prices are always set centrally by the app, trying to manage supply and demand. And they are the same for a provider, whether they're male or female, provided that they operate in the same area at the same time of day. And so therefore we are even controlling for particular personality traits that might lead women on average, this is important to highlight, women on average, having lower remuneration than men on average. So that's an important factor.
And also, actually, I've read that the data that they were looking at was between, I think, 2015, 2017, and it slightly predates the introduction of tips into the Uber model, so perhaps the one area where there would be a form of bargaining taking place.
That's right.
To quote Cathy Newman, so what you're saying is, even in a situation where female drivers simply couldn't have been discriminated against and which controlled for a range of mitigating circumstances, women appear to make different choices about the way that they drove.
Well, it's not quite like that. If you look at what factors explain the pay gap, you do find that there are non-gender factors or features of the way men and women operate on this app, which explain the difference. And specifically, what this paper finds is three. One has to do with the experience of the driver, that is, how long they've been using the app, and of course, in general, learning by doing. Is the term economists use, but experience operating in a particular environment or a particular sector or with a particular type of customer will tend to raise your hourly or daily remuneration, because you find out ways in which you can optimize it, right? The second factor was the speed of travel. So male drivers tend to drive faster than female drivers. One of the interesting questions that this poses is the extent to which insurance premiums might be different for men than women, and in this way might offset some of the gain from traveling at higher speed that men have, because if they're as a result driving less safely, they would be more prone to accidents, and therefore, insurance premiums should be expected to reflect that. I'm not aware that this study looked at that particular issue, but it would be an interesting one to explore. And then the third factor is the time and location of the provision of services. Men tend to choose, on average, times and places to provide Uber services, to log on the app, which are just more profitable. And those three factors together, experience, speed of travel, and time and location, explain fully the 7% pay gap.
Some people are arguing that this study completely explains the gender pay gap. That's one line that I read about this. But it did seem to apply to one very specific line of work, like driving. Do we see this picture being replicated further afield, where men and women are perhaps making different choices that lead to pay differentials?
Well, that's been the argument from many economists for a time. Well, economists, I should say, and others who've looked at this particular issue, is that the gender pay gap is not really explained by discrimination or, a particular bias against female suppliers, as some commentators have alleged. The factors seem to be related more to the choices that people make in life. So from most of the evidence that you will find, women are paid at the same level as men in entry-level jobs. And it's only later in life that a pay gap starts to emerge. And again, this is an aggregate pay gap. This reflects perhaps the difference between female and male workers, but it doesn't account for the various choices that they've made in life, and notably maternity and the decision to take time off during pregnancy, or the obligation, really, the fact that it's unavoidable to take time off during some stages of pregnancy and then in maternity might explain some of the pay gap. Even a few years of taking time off work change one's lifetime pattern of earnings, and also one's decision as to whether or not to return to the labour market. And it should be highlighted that these things compound over time. So the longer you've been off the labour market, the less likely you are to catch up to the previous level, and the more persistent the pay gap becomes. That, I think, is what we tend to see in cross-country evidence. It matters little the extent to which policy tries to address issues of discrimination, which I would argue have been dealt with quite effectively over the last 30 or 40 years.
Yeah, and when they do arise, I think we do already have the necessary tools in place to resolve those issues. Mm-hmm. We don't necessarily need further intervention. I wrote something about this for CapEx recently. My argument basically was that when we look at the gender pay gap across Europe and the developed world, we often encounter a slightly strange paradox, which is that you often find that countries that offer more choice to women, countries that are essentially more egalitarian in the way that they treat women and the options they give them, often end up with bigger pay gaps, and also more pronounced differences in male and female behaviour. Mm-hmm. So interestingly, in Algeria, a country that you wouldn't necessarily associate with being at the forefront of gender equality, 41% of college graduates in STEM fields, so science, technology, engineering, are female, which is roughly twice as high as the numbers from America and Britain.
Mm-hmm.
The evidence, one that I think you could perhaps infer from that, is that when given the opportunity and the choice, women will make different choices from men. And it's ironically in countries that offer fewer choices where you see more similar behaviour.
Yes, indeed. And, there might be all sorts of factors at play there. So, for example, it could be that in countries where women are generally discouraged from joining the labour force, those who do join the labour force are particularly overrepresented in certain professions, or only particularly especially talented women, the women who really truly stand out and are willing to fight against prejudice and fight against convention, make it to those professions and do make a difference. And you might see an impact on the pay gap on that basis, because the pay gap, of course, is computed from paid work. It doesn't take account of women who are outside the labour force. And so that obviously has an impact on aggregate numbers. It's very similar to discussions of productivity. People tend to say that in France, productivity is much higher than in the UK, and that's true as far as it goes. But of course, what that doesn't tell us is that labour participation in the UK is much higher. Many more people at lower income levels and of lower productivity are involved in the labour market, which is a good thing, but that tends to lower the aggregate, even though it is no bad thing in operation. And this is a similar situation where, in general, when intuition tells you that something doesn't really compute, it probably doesn't. And economists are very good at coming up with theories which might explain why it still doesn't compute, but that doesn't mean that we're not building a narrative that is false. And that actually our intuition was right in the first place.
Yeah, so the outlier effect is very important. Looking at the data on gender pay gaps around Europe, two of the countries that are considered leaders in gender equality in Europe in terms of the pay gap are Italy and Malta. Both Italy and Malta I think, has only 50% of female participation in the labour force, which is a lot lower than the average. And Italy's is, I think, also more than 10% lower than the average. So, yeah, you're right. The statistics can tell a very different story. But it is interesting that, given all of this, the government in this country and many others seems very concerned with manipulating the outcomes, intervening further to ensure that women are taking up STEM and entering the highest paid occupations. In order to get the kind of outcomes that they want, you might actually end up having to clamp down on individual choice and give women fewer options.
Yes, well, I think that's absolutely right. One of the paradoxes of trying to equalize or give people more opportunities is that you tend to be forcing yourself to constrain the opportunities of others. And we're increasingly moving not just in a direction where we seek to pursue equality of outcome, which I think a lot of people would agree is a fool's errand and can be really quite destructive in terms of social capital and cohesion and freedom of choice, but we are setting up a situation in which policy tries to create equality of opportunity by making everybody start in the same conditions. Now, making everybody start in the same conditions where a female and male candidate to a particular university place would be in the same position is perfectly fine and good, and where they can use whatever relevant factors are applicable, be they talent or experience or anything else that makes them a good candidate for it. Whenever you can make sure that only those factors count, that's certainly a good idea. However, it's really a matter of degree to what extent you wish to expand that. And there comes a point at which, in order to make the aggregate numbers look good, we are at the micro level forcing people to make choices or changing the environment so that people can make the choices, or people will make the choices rather, that we want them to make. And that I think is highly problematic, because by inclination, people have different tastes and preferences, and those might well be group traits as well as they are individual traits.
Yes, because so often the resolving of these issues, the minimisation of pay differentials, for example, is seen as an unqualified good. It's described as progress when we narrow these gaps. But if that progress comes at the cost of allowing people to, as you put it, pursuing their free choices, then I would, really critique the extent to which that would be considered progress. Actually, interestingly enough, I listened to the authors of the Uber report being interviewed by by the Freakonomics guys. Mm-hmm. What I found really interesting was the fact that they seemed really surprised by their own findings. I think they had actually expected that female drivers might be out-earning the men, partly because fewer women are in it, and that kind of outlier effect that you talked about, that the self-selecting group who become Uber drivers are not exactly representative of the wider population. But obviously the opposite was true, and I think they hoped to imply perhaps that the flexibility of the gig economy could offer some kind of solution to the gender pay gap. Do you think the results of the report suggest otherwise?
I think that, well, first of all, it should be said that, yes, women are a minority among Uber drivers, but they're not a tiny minority. I think in the US, there's somewhere between 25 and 30% of Uber drivers. So they are well represented, even if underrepresented among the driver pool. So I think the results can still be regarded as statistically significant and representative.
That seems somewhat higher than in Britain, I would guess, just purely based on my own experience of using Ubers in London.
I think so. I mean, it's probably related to car ownership and the spread of that, licensing rules, and also the pattern of involvement, right? One of the features you have in Uber in the US versus the UK is that in America it really is a part-time occupation for many people. In a small-time part-time occupation, in some cases, people will just clock in under 10 hours a week for a long time on Uber. That's not really, from my conversations with people at Uber and looking at the data, what you find in the UK or in London. For most Uber drivers here, it really is a full-time occupation. Now, for the reasons we discussed earlier, you can imagine why, how women might be less attracted to something that involves full-time commitment.
Yes. Many people have talked of the gig economy as a potential solution to some of these, of the gender pay gap and so on, because it offers women this unparalleled flexibility. And in terms of helping, for example, women who have taken time out of the workforce to care for children, to give them the flexibility that they need in their lives. But the outcome of the study suggests that perhaps untrammeled flexibility might not prove the kind of panacea that people had hoped.
It's interesting because I think that the gig economy is going to lead to the outcomes that women want, because it creates, as you say, more flexibility and choice. And if there's a particular group of people that would welcome that, it's women, because of the myriad different obligations that they face because of cultural and social convention, but also because they tend to have more aspirations in life, or broader aspirations in life, than a lot of men. For a lot of men, professional success defines their entire existence. That, I think, is a less common trait among women. And here we come back to the Jordan Peterson discussion on Channel 4, which I thought was very enlightening in that regard. So flexibility will improve, the choice architecture for women, if you will, on that basis. On the other hand, policymakers and some statisticians may not get the aggregate statistics that they would like, because flexibility and choice are a double-edged sword, and to the extent that you're allowing women to enter the labour force more flexibly, it is likely that the labour force will better reflect the choices and preferences of women than it does now, where you might have a segregated labour market, where the women whose preferences are simply not fit by the existing labour market options just stay outside and are not measured in the statistics, whereas with greater flexibility they will enter, and they will now enter the statistics. And so we might see some of the gaps that the statisticians have pointed out magnified by the advent of greater flexibility and choice. But as I say, we must look at these things on an individual basis and not take aggregate measures as the be-all and end-all. If we have had, for instance, women at the lower end of the hourly spectrum, or women whose preference for spending time with their children weighs more than for the average woman, we will see the pay gap increase, other things equal. But that is no bad thing. The individual woman we're talking about who's changed the statistics is better off because previously she couldn't get the particular paid work versus homework mix or household work mix that she wanted, whereas now she can.
I think the counter-argument that some might use to all of this is that we still live in a society which assumes and perhaps encourages women to take that time out of the workforce to care for children. And perhaps the solution could be to promote things like paternity leave. What's your take on that?
I think all these statutory mandates for leave should apply equally to men and women, and I think the idea is for them to do so. You probably will find that the firm or company provision of these particular benefits is more generous towards women simply because women are more likely to use them and women value them more.
Yeah.
And so it's part of compensation to a lot of people, the ability to take a longer period of time off. So the availability should be equal. However, we shouldn't expect that that will lead to the same choices. You were mentioning some of the Nordic countries and the Baltic countries, which are very egalitarian in their approach to this and were pioneers in implementing paternity leave and trying to make sure that whatever choices that were made were really genuinely freely made, rather than forced by either legislation or established company practice. And even there, and you know the figures better than I do, it is not the case that men take the same time off for paternity as women do for maternity.
Yeah. So in Sweden, the government actually stipulates that what they have in place is not maternity or paternity leave, but kind of parental leave that can be split completely flexibly between mother and father. And they actually stipulate that if families want to receive the full possible subsidies from government, that fathers have to use at least 60 days of the leave, which totals 480 days leave and is one of the most generous parental leave packages in the world, if not the most generous. But despite this, you still see over 80% of the leave days being taken by women. So even in a situation where the government is actually mandating paternity leave, it still doesn't have the desired outcome.
You there see how choices are being needlessly constrained.
Yeah.
I don't see how eliminating the mandate that fathers take a particular share of the overall parental leave, how that would constrain women's choices in any way. Do we really believe that in this day and age women are not capable of deciding for themselves and negotiating with their partners and discussing with their partners whatever the best arrangement is? If we're not willing to believe that, then I think we probably find ourselves in a very different world from the one we have been told we're in for a long time. That wouldn't be an auspicious development, and it certainly would, I don't think, reflect the advancements that women have made in society in recent decades.
I quite agree. Christian Niemitz would know more about this than I do, but the people who are still defending some aspects of the Soviet Union in the 21st century often point to the gender equality of the Soviets as one of the key arguments in its favour. You know, oh look, you know, they had creches in the workforce before before Sweden got around to any of this stuff. And with female labour force participation was at an all-time high. It seems pretty clear that there is a large proportion of the debate still that would love to see equality at all costs.
Yes, it's absolutely worth dealing with that question, because people tend to view it as unambiguously a good development of life in socialist countries, that women were more involved in the labour force. Now, there are two things that legislation or in that case, you know, force, because these countries really did force people into these particular areas of life. The two changes that they fostered. First of all, the cultural change whereby traditional gender roles became less prevalent in the family. Sort of, you know, the male breadwinner and the female housewife became less relevant. But then also an economic change where women were forced into the labor force because it was thought that they should contribute to production. And this was very much an economistic, but even, you know, within the sort of rudimentary economic reasoning that was involved, it was flawed, because even though GDP doesn't include or feature women's work at the home, there is absolutely no question that it is productive and contributes value to economic life. Children benefit from it, and there is certainly value that household work generates, which is not counted in national income statistics, but it doesn't mean it isn't there. Now, the Soviets, because they basically thought in terms of steel production and coal production and industrialization, had very little time for the finer things in life, such as family life and freedom of choice, and the more sophisticated accounting for how you add value in society and what things people want and what they don't. And one of the things that is fundamental in economic thinking is that you face a fundamental choice between paid work and leisure. And leisure in this case would include unpaid work, in the sense that you're willing to forego some wage in order to spend more time doing other things. We may quarrel with the idea that women are making the choices that they are making, but there's no question that they face the same calculus as everybody else, and some women, and more than men in this case, are deciding to stay at home. To second guess that particular choice when we have so much legislation making sure that choice is made in safe and equal conditions, I think would be a step too far for government.
Diego, thank you.
Thanks.
For more blogs, podcasts, films, and reports, visit our website at iea.org.uk.